Part Two of Oroonoko. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Oroonoko, or The Royal Slave, by Aphra Behn. Part Two. This prince, such as I have described him, whose soul and body was so admirably adorned, was, while yet he was in the court of his grandfather, as I said, as capable of love as 'twas possible for a brave and gallant man to be, and in saying that I have named the highest degree of love, for sure great souls are most capable of that passion. I have already said the old general was killed by the shot of an arrow by the side of this prince in battle, and that Oroonoko was made general. This old dead hero had only one daughter left of his race, a beauty, that to describe her truly, one need only say she was female to the noble male, the beautiful black Venus to our young Mars, as charming in her person as he, and of delicate virtues. I have seen 100 white men sighing after her, and making 1,000 vows at her feet, all in vain and unsuccessful, and she was indeed too great for any but a prince of her own nation to adore. Oroonoko, coming from the wars, which were now ended, after he had made his court to his grandfather, he thought in honour he ought to make a visit to Amoinda, the daughter of his foster-father, the dead general, and to make some excuses to her, because his preservation was the occasion of her father's death, and to present her with those slaves that had been taken in this last battle, as the trophies of her father's victories. When he came, attended by all the young soldiers of any merit, he was infinitely surprised at the beauty of this fair Queen of Night, whose face and person was so exceeding all that he had ever beheld, that lovely modesty with which she received him, that softness in her look and sighs, upon the melancholy occasion of this honour that was done by so great a man as Oroonoko, and a prince of whom she had heard such admirable things, the awfulness wherewith she received him, and the sweetness of her words and behaviour while he stayed, gained a perfect conquest over his fierce heart, and made him feel the victor could be subdued. So that, having made his first compliments, and presented her in 150 slaves in fetters, he told her with his eyes that he was not insensible of her charms, while Amoinda, who wished for nothing more than so glorious a conquest, was pleased to believe she understood that silent language of new-born love, and from that moment put on all her additions to beauty. The prince returned to court with quite another humour than before, and though he did not speak much of the fair Amoinda, he had the pleasure to hear all his followers speak of nothing but the charms of that maid, insomuch that, even in the presence of the old king, they were extolling her, and heightening, if possible, the beauties they had found in her, so that nothing else was talked of. No other sound was heard in every corner where there were whispers but Amoinda, Amoinda. 'Twill be imagined Oroonoko stayed not long before he made his second visit, nor, considering his quality, not much longer before he told her he adored her. I have often heard him say that he admired by what strange inspiration he came to talk things so soft and so passionate, who never knew love, nor was used to the conversation of women, but, to use his own words, he said, most happily some new and till then unknown power instructed his heart and tongue in the language of love, and at the same time in favour of him inspired Amoinda with a sense of his passion. She was touched with what he said, and returned it in all such answers as went to his very heart, with a pleasure unknown before. Nor did he use those obligations ill, that love had done him, but turned all his happy moments to the best advantage, and as he knew no vice, his flame aimed at nothing but honour, if such a distinction may be made in love, and especially in that country, where men take to themselves as many as they can maintain, and where the only crime and sin with woman is to turn her off, to abandon her to want, shame, and misery. Such ill morals are only practised in Christian countries, where they prefer the bare name of religion, and without virtue or morality think that sufficient. But Oroonoko was none of those professors, but as he had right notions of honour, so he made her such propositions as were not only and barely such, but, contrary to the custom of his country, he made her vows she should be the only woman he would possess while he lived, that no age or wrinkles should incline him to change, for her soul would always be fine, and always young, and he should have an eternal idea in his mind of the charms she now bore, and should look into his heart for that idea when he could find it no longer in her face. After 1,000 assurances of his lasting flame and her eternal empire over him, she condescended to receive him for her husband, or rather received him as the greatest honour the gods could do her. There is a certain ceremony in these cases to be observed, which I forgot to ask how 'twas performed, but 'twas concluded on both sides that, in obedience to him, the grandfather was to be the first made acquainted with the design, for they pay a most absolute resignation to the monarch, especially when he is a parent also. On the other side, the old king, who had many wives and many concubines, wanted not court flatterers to insinuate into his heart 1,000 tender thoughts for this young beauty, and who represented her to his fancy as the most charming he had ever possessed in all the long race of his numerous years. At this character, his old heart, like an extinguished brand, most apt to take fire, felt new sparks of love, and began to kindle, and now grown to his second childhood, longed with impatience to behold this gay thing with whom, alas, he could but innocently play. But how he should be confirmed she was this wonder before he used his power to call her to court, where maidens never came unless for the king's private use, he was next to consider, and while he was so doing he had intelligence brought to him that Imoinda was most certainly mistress to the Prince Oroonoko. This gave him some chagrin. However, it gave him also an opportunity, one day, when the Prince was a-hunting, to wait on a man of quality, as his slave and attendant, who should go and make a present to Imoinda, as from the Prince. He should then, unknown, see this fair maid, and have an opportunity to hear what message she would return the Prince for his present, and from thence gather the state of her heart, and degree of her inclination. This was put in execution, and the old monarch saw and burned. He found her all he had heard, and would not delay his happiness, but found he should have some obstacle to overcome her heart, for she expressed her sense of the present the Prince had sent her, in terms so sweet, so soft and pretty, with an air of love and joy that could not be dissembled, insomuch that 'twas past doubt whether she loved Oroonoko entirely. This gave the old king some affliction, but he salved it with this, that the obedience the people pay their king was not at all inferior to what they paid their gods, and what love would not oblige Imoinda to do, duty would compel her to. He was therefore no sooner got to his apartment but that he sent the royal veil to Imoinda. That is the ceremony of invitation. He sends the lady he has a mind to honour with his bed a veil, with which she is covered, and secured for the king's use, and 'tis death to disobey, besides held a most impious disobedience. 'Tis not to be imagined the surprise and grief that seized the lovely maid at this news and sight. However, as delays in these cases are dangerous, and pleading worse than treason, trembling and almost fainting, she was obliged to suffer herself to be covered and led away. They brought her thus to court, and the king, who had caused a very rich bath to be prepared, was led into it, where he sat under a canopy, in state, to receive this longed-for virgin, whom he commanded should be brought to him. They, after disrobing her, led her to the bath, and making fast the doors, left her to descend. The king, without more courtship, bade her throw off her mantle and come to his arms. But Imoinda, all in tears, threw herself on the marble, on the brink of the bath, and besought him to hear her. She told him, as she was a maid, how proud of the divine glory she should have been, of having it in her power to oblige her king, but as by the laws he could not, and from his royal goodness would not, take from any man his wedded wife, so she believed she should be the occasion of making him commit a great sin if she did not reveal her state and condition, and tell him she was another's, and could not be so happy to be his. The king, enraged at this delay, hastily demanded the name of the bold man that had married a woman of her degree without his consent. Imoinda, seeing his eyes fierce and his hands tremble, whether with age or anger I know not, but she fancied the last, almost repented she had said so much, for now she feared the storm would fall on the Prince. She therefore said 1,000 things to appease the raging of his flame, and to prepare him to hear who it was with calmness. But before she spoke, he imagined who she meant, but would not seem to do so, but commanded her to lay aside her mantle, and suffer herself to receive his caresses, or by his gods he swore that happy man whom she was going to name should die, though it were even Oroonoko himself. Therefore, said he, deny this marriage, and swear thyself a maid. That, replied Amoinda, by all our powers I do, for I am not yet known to my husband. 'Tis enough, said the king, 'tis enough both to satisfy my conscience and my heart. And rising from his seat, he went and led her into the bath, it being in vain for her to resist. In this time the prince, who was returned from hunting, went to visit his Amoinda, but found her gone, and not only so, but heard she had received the royal veil. This raised him to a storm, and in his madness they had much ado to save him from laying violent hands on himself. Force first prevailed, and then reason. They urged all to him that might oppose his rage, but nothing weighed so greatly with him as the king's old age, uncapable of injuring him with Amoinda. He would give way to that hope, because it pleased him most and flattered best his heart. Yet this served not altogether to make him cease his different passions, which sometimes raged within him and softened into showers. 'Twas not enough to appease him, to tell him his grandfather was old, and could not that way injure him, while he retained that awful duty which the young men are used there to pay to their grave relations. He could not be convinced he had no cause to sigh and mourn for the loss of a mistress he could not with all his strength and courage retrieve. And he would often cry, "Oh, my friends, were she in walled cities, or confined from me in fortifications of the greatest strength, did enchantments or monsters detain her from me, I would venture through any hazard to free her. But here, in the arms of a feeble old man, my youth, my violent love, my trade in arms, and all my vast desire of glory avail me nothing. Amoinda is as irrecoverably lost to me as if she were snatched by the cold arms of death. Oh, she is never to be retrieved. If I would wait tedious years till fate should bow the old king to his grave, even that would not leave me Amoinda free, but still that custom that makes it so vile a crime for a son to marry his father's wives or mistresses would hinder my happiness, unless I would either ignobly set an ill precedent to my successors, or abandon my country, and fly with her to some unknown world who never heard our story. But it was objected to him that his case was not the same, for Amoinda being his lawful wife by solemn contract, 'twas he the injured man, and might, if he so pleased, take Amoinda back, the breach of the law being on his grandfather's side, and that if he could circumvent him, and redeem her from the Otan, which is the palace of the king's women, a sort of seraglio, it was both just and lawful for him to do so. This reasoning had some force upon him, and he should have been entirely comforted, but for the thought that she was possessed by his grandfather. However, he loved so well that he was resolved to believe what most favoured his hope, and to endeavour to learn from Amoinda's own mouth what only she could satisfy him in, whether she was robbed of that blessing which was only due to his faith and love. But as it was very hard to get a sight of the women, for no men ever entered into the Otan but when the king went to entertain himself with some one of his wives or mistresses, and 'twas death at any other time for any other to go in, so he knew not how to contrive to get a sight of her. Part 2.